Let's continue with our conversations around reconciliation and race. Someone who's examined this issue, thought about it deeply, is the CEO of the HSRC, Professor Crane Sudin. He's the Chief Executive of the Human Sciences Research Council. Professor Sudin, good afternoon to you. I mean, so often when we talk about race, it's in reaction to a conflict. So it could be cynical or Brackenfell High, maybe the Treasema advert. We seem to talk about race reactively and not necessarily in a sort of much more thorough and proper manner.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Yes, and it's undoubtedly for very many of us, and I say that for very many of us, an extremely difficult conversation to have. So we have a history in the country over the last 20 years of trying to institute dialogues. And they have signally been, I think it's important to say to everybody, not easy ones. We have a few, often the converted, who come to these things, but people who really should be in the conversation are difficult to gather around.
Why is that? I mean, why do we never sit down, apart from today, the Day of National Reconciliation, why do we never sit down and say, let's talk about it outside of a conflict?
So there are marked differences in, if you like, the composition of the people in the room often when those conversations happen. There often are Black people, largely. If there are white people present, they're often females. White males are particularly awkward around all of these conversations. The conversations are awkward, as all of us in the country will easily tell you, because they talk about shame and they talk about guilt. They talk about these questions of revenge and so on. And so they have all the ingredients of deep emotional things that actually we need quite concerted attention to get to the heart of. And so it's not easy to conduct a conversation like this on a basis which is everyday. There are many routes which one has to take to get to a point of meaningful engagement, and it's often requires quite skilled facilitation.
Professor, it's fascinating the point you make about men and women, and particularly white men and white women. I mean, I can think off the top of my head of 3 or 4 academics, white academics, who study this, who talk about this. I think the academic phrase sometimes is diversity studies. Almost all of them are women. I can think of very few men, and I think the same might hold for the United States.
Of course. So these two countries have history of similarity over the last 400 years, call it 500 years if you like. And the way in which, they're awkward things, the way in which privilege and power have been mediated in those particular spaces, particularly the ways in which men have been socialized into responsibility, into position, is fundamentally for particular forms of privilege to come to rest in particularly very preponderantly privileged, I'm repeating that word, ways, and to talk about its undoing is absolutely essential. It's not a job which we will achieve in undoing it overnight. It'll take many years, and it begins with young people, unfortunately. And so there is a difference, to mark another sociological, significantly different reality here. There is a difference between younger people and older people. Younger people are far easier to start these conversations with. They're far more comfortable with each other around these things. And a particularly important group of people in the country are civil servants. You have white civil servants in the country, and they are more comfortable with their peers and with their colleagues. It's less so in the private sector, I think. people outside of those formal working environments struggle with these kinds of questions. And we have to be asking a lot, I want to say, Stephen, of religious organizations. It's in religious organizations where people have access to hearing audiences, and we should hold them to account a whole lot more. There isn't an equivalent space in the country where we could be talking to each other.
That's fascinating. There's an issue around our history, and I realize, of course, our present and where we are is formed by this. But I would suggest that there's another problem around our perhaps lack of agreement and lack of knowledge, almost on a common set of facts. So let me give you a couple of examples and let me put them to you. I would suggest that there are people in this country who could tell you all about Slagtersneck, an important event a long, long time ago that was part of the birth of Afrikaner nationalism. And there are people, and those people wouldn't know anything about Kgosi Mampuru II. And the people who know that Kgosi Mampuru II was killed, I think it was 1902, in the prison that now bears his name in Tshwane, notice Tshwane, not Pretoria, wouldn't know anything about Slagtersneck and why that was important. I mean, it seems to me often, it's not that we don't even agree on common facts, it's that we know nothing about each other's histories.
Well, a city like Pretoria is an important example to talk about. Pretoria has resegregated in such reproductive kinds of ways that the number of white people that you would have in the inner city in Pretoria who know the inner city, you can count, and of course I'm exaggerating, on one hand. It's the way in which all these structures in which we participate in come to compound and affirm each other. And so it's only, I spoke earlier about religion, but it's in school where the possibility is going to exist that those children are going to learn about that. And they will learn about that in a less emotive way than would have been the case 20 or 25 years ago. Our history is better. There's no doubt about it. Our schools are trying, and we often hit our schools, but I'd like to say that there are really big efforts that are taking place in the education department to try and correct these kinds of things. But it's stuff which gets counter acted, if you like, when children go home in the afternoon to their parents. You know, the parents are sitting around the table, if they have that privilege of having dinner together. And those dinners are historically toxic occasions. You know, we really have to think creatively, and this is why I come back to, you know, religious organizations. And our country is supposedly one of the most religious in the world, and so we have to have an account of what's going on in those institutions. You know, it's not enough to talk to people about the life hereafter. It's really critical to talk about what's going on right now around you, you know, and how you give dignity to all who are supposedly God's children, you know. So it's a command which we have to be insisting on. So we have a lot of work to do to think of how we creatively, and so Reconciliation Day itself is a factor in holding up in some ways this particular process, because it simply reproduces our current standoffs with each other. You know, they are breeding grounds for producing resentment, and the way in which we conduct these things has to be depoliticized, I have to say. I have been part of December the 16th reconciliation occasions in Cape Town over the last 10 years. We've not had one this year, but the occasions have been multi-faith, they've been multi-gender, people with different understandings of who they are, and they've been really creative. We've walked across the city to be in each other's company and to go to deliberately to places where we wouldn't go. So there's a need for creativity around all of this, and not the kind of tub thumping which I think we have, which simply inflames people's very vulnerable and base emotions.
You mentioned how difficult it can be to talk about race. We were talking about gender at the time, but I think there's another difficulty perhaps around words. And I don't know, firstly, language is an issue because, you and I are speaking in English, and there's a reason for that. There's an important economic reason for that. But people can also have very different identities. So it's usually wrong, or I suppose actually always wrong, to look at someone, to make a presumption about someone's identity just by looking at them. And yet people will sometimes, if you ask someone, I'm a white man, I will self-identify, is the phrase, in that way. So I sometimes worry that we don't actually have the words, and yet the words are important. I think it's important to know, for example, how many black female learners get matric distinctions for maths and science. I think that's an important thing for us to know. And yet, I might find that I will ask, someone who I then presume to be a black female learner in matric, and she will say, well, I don't identify as black. Perhaps I identify as Muslim. I identify as something else. I sometimes think we don't quite have the language, the vocabulary, the lexicography, whatever it is, to actually have the conversation.
So I've heard you on the radio frequently getting into spats with people around all of this. And so there's a really big divide between the way in which these conversations are happening in the academic community, scholarly community, and the everyday community. In the academic community, there's a strong awareness of all of these identities being socially constructed. Now, they're very academic words, but what they are saying is that none of the identities we carry are natural. And that's a really important scientific fact to come to terms with. No identity we've got is an identity which is in our genes, except, of course, illnesses. So if I'm diabetic, I can quite legitimately say I'm a diabetic. But every other identity I'm going to invoke is one which is one that I have either taken on or has been given to me. And so the way in which people come to you, Stephen, is always going to be filled with the complexity of that. There's no right or wrong around it. We can't deny people the right to self-identify. But we can have opinions about what those identities are. And there are some social descriptions that are problematic. We're having real difficulty at the moment in deciding what black is and what African is. Real difficulty. And I'd like to ask you in particular, simply because of the audience that you're able to command and have at your disposal, to find a little bit of space for some of us to come in and talk about these things, because it's almost an academic secret. And it's necessary to take these academic secrets out to help, and I'm not saying this with any condescension at all. I'm not patronizing anybody. To help the public conversation around all of this. The conversation around truckers, for example, is filled with the difficulties of what we're talking about. It's absolutely filled. And they come to bring people to cul-de-sacs in the ways in which they argue, which are very problematic. So there's a lot to talk about, please, Stephen.
Professor Soodien, I absolutely guarantee to give you that opportunity. Thank you very much indeed for your wisdom and for your thoughts today. Professor Crane Soodien is the Chief Executive of the HSRC. Such an important conversation. More to come. Stay with us.